Muhammad.
ازيك يا عزيزي?
Hi, how are you?
I am very well. How are you?
Fine, I'm fine. We're
That's
waiting
good.
for some participants.
Okay.
You know, today I participated in one other meeting on Libya with our French colleagues, and the main topic was the main subject. The main idea was what they repeated from one presentation to another one. It was about Pax Russia-Turkish
Yes.
pact there, and
Yeah.
unsure about Wagner Group.
Yeah.
I. Of course, our meeting today is not dedicated to Russian politics in Libya, but I think that, it would be useful and maybe interesting if we, in our discussion after Muhammad's presentation, maybe we should touch this this topic and with this issue. I think it will be interesting to everybody, especially take into consideration the fact that we have several experts here who have written their papers last months on Libya and Russian Libya. Alexander Shumilin has published his article in Novaya Gazeta about 2 days ago, I think, or yesterday, on how it is called, play for interests, on Libya. Konstantin Truyevtsev, who is also with us, has published a lot of materials on Libya, and other colleagues too. So I think that it can be quite interesting. I don't know, maybe one our colleague from Turkey will join us. I mean,
Galib.
Galib, yes. He said me that he try, but I don't know if he can or not. Because sure, I think that today to talk about Libya, it means partly to talk about Turkey too.
Absolutely.
Anyway, we can start. And dear friends, I'm glad to welcome you at our meeting. It is one of a series of meeting which is organized by Institute of Oriental Studies, Center for Arab and Islamic Studies, and Moscow State University, and with the support and by the initiative by of the Middle East Club of the Faculty of World Politics of the Moscow State University. Thank you guys for this idea, for organizing this meeting, and for your technical support. Last weeks and last months, we have been watching very interesting process, dynamics in Libyan conflict, but usually they talk about geostrategic and geopolitical interests in Libya. And there are not so much discussion, not so big discussion about the oil factor in Libya. Of course, everybody understands that oil plays a big role, very important role, this factor plays in Libyan conflict. But unfortunately, maybe because it demands more professionalism than to talk about geopolitics, you know. So it is a little bit more difficult to talk about. So I'm very glad that Muhammad Eldzarh, our dear colleague and my big friend, is with us today. About how we will work. We will work about 1 hour and a half. We'll start with Muhammad's presentation, about 20 minutes. And then we'll open a free discussion of the topic. before we start with Muhammad, I have to make some publicity to our other meetings which will be organized. I will send information to the chat. Next week it will be the 24th. We'll have a meeting with our colleague from Bahrain on Russian Saudi interaction in the Gulf. And 25th, we'll have a public lecture by Daniel Kurtzer, which will be moderated by Vitaly Naumkin. It will be about Israeli-Palestinian conflict. After this little publicity, I'm glad to give floor to Muhammad. Muhammad, please, about 20 minutes. And then
okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vasily, for the invitation. Thank you to all the participants here. I was asked to talk for 20 minutes. I will try my best to talk for less and to give the chance for a more interactive and question, if you like, or exchange-based interaction. My talk will be structured in the following way. I will have a very quick opening about the kingdom or the King Idris era, and then very briefly on the Gaddafi regime to just give some highlights on it. And then a lot of focus will be on the post-Gaddafi Libya in terms of the oil and gas issue. And then I will look at the regional and the international dimension of what is going on in terms of the conflict, because today everything is being decided either in Moscow or Ankara or Cairo or elsewhere, but not in Libya. So I think this will be a very pertinent part of the intervention. And then I will close off by some remarks about the current standoff that we see, especially in the central region of Libya, Sirt Jufra, whether Sirt is a red line, whether there is some sort of an understanding or not. So I will delve a little bit into that. And I will start with something that the late King Idris said when oil was discovered in Libya. And he said, "I wish you had found water. Water makes men work. Oil makes men dream." And I think his concern has turned out to be true, where the oil seems to have become a curse for Libya. And he made these remarks in the 1950s when Libya first made its first successful drill in 1959, and then exported its first oil in 1961. And from being from one of the poorest nations on earth, dependent on foreign aid and help from the United States and Britain in particular, Libya, in terms of the income per capita, became one of the richest countries. I think there is a very interesting element in that historical perspective, which was the abolishment of the federal governing structure in Libya in 1963. That's 2 years after the first shipment of Libyan export during the kingdom's era. And according to some accounts, apparently certain prominent families during the King era, but also international or multinational oil companies at the time, lobbied and played a key role in the abolishment of the federal and of the federal governing system in Libya and replacing it with a unitary decentralized system based on 10 governorates. What's also interesting is that there was no referendum or no referendum took place to abolish federalism in Libya in 1963, and the lobbying efforts succeeding in getting that change passed through the legislative chamber of Libya's 3 old historical regions. But there was no public referendum on the issue. And moving into the Gaddafi era very quickly, what we witnessed during the Gaddafi regime was a very centralized system of management for the oil and gas, very exclusive for the Gaddafi regime, but also very centralized management and control over the revenues of the oil. There has been complete lack of transparency. There was no inclusiveness in the way that revenues were distributed to the population. What we ended up with is a rentier state, no development of key sectors in Libya, be it education, health, infrastructure, or the economic diversification of the country. However, an interesting element developed during the Gaddafi era was that the way that the oil and gas pipelines and networks in Libya were built and were designed and developed is that they connected the country. They unified the country even more. So today, for example, between the three old regions, i.e. you have oil fields that are based in Western Libya, but are connected to oil terminals in the east and terminals in the south that are connected to the west and vice versa. So today, with the intensification of the conflict, some people are talking about partition being as a potential or possible scenario of the country for the country, for example. But I think the issue of the oil and gas and the issue of the infrastructure that connects the three old regions or the entire country in some respects will always be, a sticking point going forward in case we reach a point where we would need to go that way. Now I will talk about the post-Gaddafi era. And obviously, as we all understand, that the post-Gaddafi era was characterized by insecurity, lack of rule of law, and any form of oversight mechanisms over key economic and financial institutions. And what we ended up is armed groups of political factions vying for control of the oil terminals or the oil revenues and of the key economic institution, and there was no proper oversight or rule of law or transparency in that process. Another element has been, since the fall of the Gaddafi regime in 2011, another element has been struggle between armed groups for control and providing security for oil and gas infrastructure in Libya. And control over installations as a means to extract money and favors from the authorities, but also from international oil companies that are operating in Libya. And there have been instances for that, where international oil companies have been involved in dealings with local groups to ensure the security of their infrastructure or their sites and installations. The other point was the lack of transparency when it comes to the oil and gas sector, the NOC in particular. They do publish their the revenues, but what they do not publish is details about the sales and the marketing of the oil, of the crude oil. And insider sources, for example, have told me through my work is that now more than 70% of Libya's oil is being marketed and sold through trade houses, i.e. a third or a middleman doing the process. Under the Gaddafi regime, it was the opposite. 75% of marketing and sale happened directly to end users, cutting any options for corruption in that regard. So insider sources within the oil and gas sector these days are talking about rampant corruption, if you like, or mismanagement of the oil sale and marketing contracts within the existing NOC structure. Another element in the oil and gas sector in Libya is that vital oil and gas infrastructure was caught in fighting, and significant damage has been sustained to some of the facilities, especially in the central region of Libya and the oil terminals in the oil crescent of Libya. There were also attacks by some jihadist groups in the 2015, 2016 years. And also, since 2012 or 11, we have seen the oil and gas being used as a political bargaining chip by various political or actors in Libya. The federalists in Libya, especially Jadran, used that and shut the oil down for more than 2 years and established his own government in 2013 in protest at the complete and absolute control of Tripoli over the oil revenues and the distribution of oil revenues, etc. Also, tribes in eastern and southern Libya have used the oil and gas infrastructure to air their grievances and legitimate grievances. And recently we have seen how Khalifa Haftar, just before the Berlin conference in January of this year, how he managed to weaponize the closure of the oil terminals, or the shutting down of the oil terminals and the oil fields, basically, and effectively bringing Libya's output to a halt. And in that respect, what Haftar and Jadran and others do is that they weaponize the grievances, the local grievances of local populations and local tribes, which are legitimate grievances, but they do weaponize them in the context of the conflict in order to further their own narrow-minded agenda. There were also cases where, given that Libya's financial market in some respects is currently controlled by the parallel money traders, or let's say the currency, parallel foreign currency traders in Libya, they have also been implicated in some incidents where they wanted the oil to be shut down in order to raise the exchange rate of the US dollar or whatever, in order for them to make some profit. There have been cases of that also happening. I think there were two noticeable developments that happened in 2018 and 2019. The first was that British Petroleum sold half its assets in Libya to Italy's Eni, and then we saw ExxonMobil as well selling its concession rights to French Total in Libya after reaching agreements with Libyan authorities. And again, these developments have cast doubts over the future of Libya's hydrocarbons industry and the commitment of newcomers, or the commitment of international oil companies in Libya. Now I will touch on the regional and the international dimension of the conflict in Libya, and within taking into consideration the question of the energy. So what we have in Libya, or we had since 2012, we had two regional blocks that have been fighting each other. We have the Turkey-Qatar versus the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and then Egypt joined in after the fall of the Muslim Brotherhood rule in Cairo. Although it is ideological in some parts of it, of course, where we have Islamist autocrats versus military and monarchist autocrats fighting it on the soil of the Arab Spring nations, or what was known as the Arab Spring nations. But there is also an economic factor and a geopolitical factor, where these blocs and these countries, these regional powers, are trying to project their influence and their power, not just through ideology, but also through control of economic opportunities in a place like Libya. And then on the European side, we have Italy versus France. And again, it is to do with securing interests, but also projection of influence and safeguarding interests. For France, for Italy, we have the energy and the question of energy and the question of migration, and both of which are centered in Western Libya. These Italian interests are mainly centered in Western Libya, where Italy will always have to have a good relationship with whomever is in control in Tripoli. And then France, you have the issue of terrorism and Sahel, and then also the issue of energy being a key factor there. And obviously the natural area of influence for France has always been the South, but we have witnessed since 2014 that France has invested heavily in its relationship with the Eastern camp, or with Khalifa Haftar in particular, in relation, in cooperation with the Egyptians and the Emiratis. And now I delve into the Moscow-Turkey dynamic, which I think is the most important now. And it is for very obvious reasons, because it seems that only Turkey and Moscow, or Turkey and Russia, are willing to use hard force to conduct their foreign policy. And that puts them to be possibly the key shapers of Libya's future going forward. So what we have is we have the East-Med standoff, where by some accounts we can see Moscow's interests actually overlapping with Ankara. What we mean by that is that the attempt to prevent a gas pipeline to Europe through the agreement between Greece, Cyprus, Israel and Egypt, which would lessen the dependency of Europe on Russian energy. And there you could have an overlap where Turkey's signing of a delimitation, an exclusive economic zone and delimitation border, maritime border delimitation agreement can actually play a role there. And that is an area where we might witness an overlap or some sort of agreement between the Russians and the Turks in Libya. On the Russian part, partly I think Russia is interested in projection of its military power and influence in the southern Mediterranean flank. But the energy element as well is a key one. 2008, for example, Gazprom made an offer to the Gaddafi regime to buy all of Libya's oil exports, to have exclusive right for that. In 2017, we saw the signing of Rosneft signed a deal with Tripoli's NOC to develop oil fields. Plus, they also secured the one-year oil sale contract. We saw that Tatneft, for example, suspended its activities in Libya in 2013, but the interest is definitely still there. I think it's important for us, the importance of Libya for Russia should be viewed in a wider way, or in a wide way. And I think Libya is viewed as a country that will have a key place for the future of global energy market. And in addition to that, being also a potential post for Russian military assets and power projection in the southern Mediterranean. For Turkey, I think what we witnessed between Turkey and Russia is an interesting dynamic of some sort in the conflict. They are on the opposite side of the conflict in Libya, but the action of the Wagner group on the Tripoli front lines in the summer of last year enabled Turkey to do what it did with the GNA. Turkey exploited the weakness and the near collapse of the GNA because of the intervention of the Wagner group, and ended up signing the two important and fateful agreements in November of last year. Now, what we are witnessing is that the successes, the military successes of Turkey and the GNA in Western Libya seem to be enabling Russia's fortunes in Eastern Libya. And that is important. That's an interesting dynamic to keep an eye on. One important element to keep in mind with regards to the energy is that the exclusive economic zone that was created with the signing of the maritime border agreement between the GNA and Turkey is that the borders are actually located on the coastal lines of Tobruk and Darna, i.e. the furthest east of the country, which the GNA does not control. And the prospects of partition, if you like, will be scary for Turkey nonetheless, because it will not have achieved a key element of what it wanted to achieve in Libya, and that is the exclusive economic zone there. And I think that will play an important role in the current standoff that we are witnessing, which is what I am going into. So currently the standoff, people are talking about the standoff in Sirte and Jofra, and that Sirte was a red line. The Deputy Prime Minister, Ahmed Maitig, apparently conveyed the message after his recent visit to Moscow, that Moscow sees CERT as a red line, and that now is time for negotiations and to settle things down. Obviously, that prompted some angry reactions from the GNA side, but also from Turkey as well. My assessment is that we are likely to witness an escalation in violence in CERT and the Jufra areas. Although Russia would like them to be a red line and an attempt and an opportunity to resume meaningful political dialogue, I don't think that for the Turks or the Americans, CERT is a red line. I think the Turks, with the blessing of the Americans, are now mobilizing significant firepower, and I think they are preparing for a military operation that would ensure the Russians do not have access to Gardabiya Air Base or to Jufra Air Base in Libya. So the preparations in that regard are underway. The recent visit by part of the recent visit by the large Turkish delegation to Tripoli was partly to focus on this, the preparations for this military operation. On their part, the LNA, in coordination with the Russian assets or PMCs that exist on the ground, are also planning to push against this by taking the war back to Western Libya. So there is currently preparation and reinforcements being directed to the south of Tripolitania, i.e. the Mizda area, Ghiryan area, and so on. And we are likely going to witness the LNA and with the help of their allies to try and push there. Now, there has been a concerted US diplomatic effort to bring the GNA, Turkey on one side and Egypt closer together, where the United States is hoping that Egypt can become or play the role of the equalizer in eastern Libya, the equalizer against Turkey. And basically the aim of the United States is trying to distribute the roles for its various allies in the region in an attempt to curb the Russian influence there. I will stop with this last point. I think the only countries that are willing to use force or deploy proper military capabilities in Libya will be the ones that will definitely shape the future of the country and secure their influence. For now, it seems that Turkey and Russia seem to be at the forefront. However, I think what we are going to witness going forward is that Turkey and the US in the coming period are going to test the resolve of Russia and how serious Russia is really committed in a military sense to Eastern Libya or to the conflict in Libya. And Vasily, I'll stop here and we can open it to discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Muhammad. Thank you for your brilliant presentation, as usual. Very useful and very interesting. We can start our discussion. I see hand of Konstantin Truevtsev. Konstantin, please, your intervention or question, please. Just a second, dear participants, you can also write questions to our chat, or you can signal me in some way. So I will give you the floor. Konstantin, you have to.
I have two questions. First question is, can you, thank you for your brilliant presentation, first of all. And then I have two questions. The first one is, do you have any information about how the relations of the global oil companies are divided in Libya? For instance, what oil players, global oil players rely upon Siraj, say, upon the government of National Concord, and what oil companies rely on Haftar? That is question number one. The second question is, there was an information, rather recent information, it was exactly when Haftar army was defeated in the western part of Libya, although it managed to seize the oil installations in the western part of Libya, and so and still controls it. Is it right or not? If it is, then the picture is somewhat different from we usually understand of what is happening in Libya. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the two questions, Konstantin. And on the first question, according to UN Security Council resolutions, it is the National Oil Corporation that's based in Tripoli that has the sole right to oversee, manage Libya's oil and gas sector. So all of the international companies deal with the NOC in Tripoli. That is in accordance with the law, and that is the only possible way for them to do business. However, given that, as you rightly pointed out in your second question, that most of the oil, 90% of the oil and gas infrastructure is still under the influence or the control of the LNA, Khalifa Haftar, or the Eastern authorities. But that control of the oil and gas facilities did not translate in the right of the Eastern authorities or Khalifa Haftar to sell the oil and to get the revenues out of the oil. He did not manage to do that. Before him, Ibrahim Jadran tried to do it in 2013, and the Americans intervened and they stopped the vessel or the tanker, and they took it to back to Tripoli. The French recently have stopped another tanker that was attempting to take oil out from Eastern Libya, part of their Irene operation. So the Eastern authorities have only relied on some rogue oil traders or some shady oil traders to buy the oil or take the oil from them. According to contacts that I had, there were Egyptian offers or offers from Egyptian businesses, from Emirati businesses, but also from some Eastern Europeans and Russian businesses to try and buy crude oil at a much lower rate from the Eastern authorities. However, all of these efforts have so far failed. With regards to your question, I think for Turkey and the GNA, the question of oil is key, and control over oil is key. And this is why I do not think that Sirt or Jufra are a red line for the Turks. They will move as far as to control the oil terminals in the east. They will stop there and then maybe will enter into negotiations. But for the GNA and for Turkey to fund whatever security or governance structures they will want to establish in the coming period, which will be the test of their success, they will need to have access to that vital revenue. Because Khalifa Haftar, despite the recent military defeats, he definitely still has the oil and gas card. Recently, for example, the Sharara and Al-Fil oil fields in the south west of Libya reopened temporarily after negotiations by the GNA with locals to reopen the two oil fields. But what happened is that Khalifa Haftar's actors or allies in the south intervened and they stopped the oil flow, which again indicates that it is not a straightforward process to reopen the terminals, and it is only likely if military force is used. And if military force is used, then there is the risk of further damage to vital oil and gas infrastructure in Libya. But there is no doubt that Turkey and the GNA want to have control over the oil terminals and the oil facilities, and also the oil revenue. That for them is a key objective in the coming period.
Thank you. As I have seen, we have a question of Jean-Louis Romani. Jean-Louis, s'il vous plaît. Jean-Louis, vous êtes avec nous maintenant?
Yes, do you hear me? I also put the video on so you can see me.
Yes, hi.
Hi, Mohammed. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Sorry for joining late, so I may have missed a few things that you said. You can just dismiss a question in case you already answered it. I actually agree with your point on the red line on Sirte. I don't know why everybody's getting caught up with it. I think actually Sirte is likely to fall, and it's not a real red line. Although I heard that some of Wagner fighters have been moved there, signaling at least an intent, which I do not read, and I'm not clear of. I do believe that a red line, if there is one, is certainly on the Royal Crescent. But let me come to Russia. Why can't Russia and Turkey agree? Because we agree that they share a lot of strategic objectives. And actually, I shared your same analysis just 3 weeks ago with a similar discussion to this, and particularly questioning the theory that there would be a major escalation that Claudio Gazzini was putting forth. And in fact, we're not seeing this major escalation. Although there is a buildup of forces, I think the buildup of forces is mainly geared towards taking control of Libya, not actually facing each other. I don't see these two countries, Turkey and Russia, coming to a heading. But my question is, why can't they agree? And is Russia in Libya for the long haul, in your point of view, or is Libya simply a bargaining chip, a wonderful bargaining chip to get other things? So the main question is Russia in Libya for the long run, does it have major strategic interests, or it can bargain and just leave Libya in the hand of others? And then one quick thing, you mentioned U.S. military intervention. I'm not sure I captured that well. I wonder if you can confirm that that's what you say, that there may be a U.S. military intervention in Libya. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, John Louis, and it's good to have you with us. Is Russia in for the long term in Libya or not? In my view, I think.
Mohammed, I'm very sorry. We have another question on the mainly very close to this one. Is the question: do you really believe rumors that Russia wants to set up a port and Airbus in Sirte? If you can highlight this question too in your answer, it will be great.
Okay, so the two questions are linked. The question of I recently published about this interesting writ large dynamic between Turkey and Russia, where I actually can see that the actions of Russia in Tripoli, or the actions of the Wagner in Tripoli in September or late last summer, have definitely given Turkey the foothold that it needs and the influence that it needs with the GNA. It led to the advances by Khalifa Haftar in Tripoli, and it caused panic within the GNA, and it almost led to the fall of the GNA, which eventually translated into the GNA accepting the terms of the Turks to sign the two agreements on the security cooperation, but also on the maritime borders. The way I see it is that the military successes that we now witness in by Turkey and the GNA will most likely, the Eastern camp and Khalifa Haftar have never been this vulnerable before. They are the most vulnerable they have been, and they will be even more vulnerable once Sirte and Jufra fall, and then we see a move on the oil crescent. And if Egypt and the UAE are no longer able to provide meaningful support that can stop this, the only partner will be Russia. But what sort of problems does Russia have in terms of the long term? I think Russia wants to have long-term presence in Libya, be it on the military front, but in terms of also like establishing long-term military presence, in Tobruk and in the naval ports of Tobruk and Derna, or having an air base in Libya. I think if that opportunity is there, I think Russia will not hesitate to take that opportunity. But there are difficult questions and hurdles for Russia. Unlike Turkey, which is dealing with the government of national accord, a government that is still recognized by the UN Security Council resolution. Sarraj's representative is still the one representing Libya in front of the UN Security Council. So the argument that Turkey is making is the same argument that Russia is making in Syria, that they came to help the legitimate government of Syria, of Bashar al-Assad. Turkey is doing that. Russia does not have that at the moment in Libya. They do not have that political interlocutor, political Libyan interlocutor who has both domestic and international, most importantly, international legitimacy to deal with. But maybe this is why they are now playing with the idea of Aguila Saleh being the head of the parliament and also internationally recognized in the same UN Security Council resolutions as the head of the sole legislative authority in Libya. And we have seen the Russian government playing up the role and the contacts with Aguila Saleh. But whether or not Aguila Saleh will go in that direction, it is not very clear. Because the Egyptians and the Emiratis still have influence. And I think the Americans too have influence on the Egyptians and the Emiratis to make sure that Aguila Saleh does not do any sort of move that would enable Russia more or give Russia the political legal cover or the veneer, if you like, of political legal cover that he can do if he signs something with them. So it's because of that, Turkey has the advantage. What we are witnessing in Libya is the opposite of Syria, where in some respects, it definitely is a Turkey-Russia game, but in Libya, it is Turkey that is going to be calling the shots, just like Russia is the player that is calling the shots. I agree with this reading of the situation that I came across recently. So that's what we're witnessing. But in my view, the mindset of both regimes in Ankara and in Moscow, despite the fact that they are on the opposite sides of the conflict, both in Syria and in Libya, have shown great ability and skill at managing this current rivalry on the backdrop of their strategic alliance, their potential strategic alliance in the region. And I don't see why Russia and Turkey would not cooperate in Libya, except the United States factor and the NATO factor in the process, who will be there trying to stop any form of a deal, the Europeans and the Americans in particular, any form of a deal between Russia and Turkey.
We have a question by Vladimir Bartenev. Vladimir?
Yes. Hi, nice to see you. I have actually two questions. One is related to the brief story of the oil, attitude to oil distribution of oil revenues that you provided, starting with the King Idris and then Gaddafi regime. And now, if we think about the Cairo initiative that was announced 2 weeks ago, there is a point, as you perfectly know there, about the reorganization of the Libyan economic institutions during the transitional period that they see should last for 1 year and a half. And basically among these three economic institutions that should be reorganized is Central Bank, National Oil Corporation, and Libyan Investment Authority. So what do you think is the viable solution for the reorganization of the corporation? Is there any? What do you think is actually, what is behind this point in this initiative? What is the Eastern side back by Egypt actually promoting through this particular point in the initiative? This is question number one. I hope that it's clear, right?
It is, yes.
Yeah. And another question is about your assessment of the US role that actually you described in a very interesting way. You said that the US now would like to see Egypt as a sort of stabilizer against the Turkey influence, basically to replace Russian influence on Haftar and the East, right?
Yes.
You said that. But do you think that the US under the Trump administration actually has any leverage whatsoever on Cairo? Real leverage that can actually make Egypt government decide towards one option or another option in Libya? Thank you.
Should I go, Vasilia? Okay. Very important question on the issue of oil and gas wealth distribution or revenue distribution and management of economic institutions. The Cairo Declaration is not the first declaration or the first initiative to talk about this very important issue. Even the Berlin Declaration and also some UN Security Council resolutions over the last couple of years have been emphasizing the unity of Libya's oil and gas sector, but the NOC, but also most importantly have also been pushing for equitable, transparent management and oversight of the oil and gas revenues. And when we talk about this issue, we should always be mindful in what context we are talking about it. Are we talking about it in the current context of conflict, or the context of transition from conflict to peace, or a peaceful context, which would have different implications in each of the cases? If it is the conflict, it's very difficult to see how an agreement on the oil can be reached unless it is part of a wider political agreement that's backed by the international community and the United Nations. It's very difficult to see that. What we end up with is the current status quo, where one side of the conflict has access to the oil revenues, the other side has control over the assets, like the vital infrastructure and so on. And in order to get out of this quagmire, it's very important that certain mechanisms, as part of any international effort, to make sure that there is proper oversight in the way that the oil revenue is managed and distributed. That should include auditing processes, that should include international oversight mechanisms. Because what we have today is one part of the conflict has access to that money or to that revenue, which is the GNA, and is able to use it. The other side does not have that access and relies mainly on debt and relies on commercial bank loans in Eastern Libya and so on, which has had very negative impact on the overall economic and financial situation. If we are talking about a peaceful context, then that is something that would be resolved in a constitution-making process. And there has been a lot of discussion in this regard. But the current constitution draft that was produced in 2016 but never ratified does look at the issue of oil distribution, or formulas on how oil revenue should be distributed between the central government and provisional government in there. Now, the issue of the NOC and the reorganization of the NOC. I think there has been a lot of cooperation between the Eastern authorities and the NOC in Tripoli. And cooperation that happens under the table, but one that ensures that certain operations continue, certain appointments. For example, when there was the Brega oil company was split in two after the Turkish intervention in Libya was formalized. So what the Brega oil marketing company in Eastern Libya decided to break ranks with the NOC. But international effort has allowed for appointment of a new body to that company, and then it is now cooperating back with the NOC in Tripoli. One of the things that has happened with the help of this company, Brega Oil Marketing Company, is that they brought in an illegal shipment, what was known as an illegal shipment of fuel from the Emirates to Benghazi. But insider contacts have said that this has happened with the full knowledge of the NOC in Tripoli. Just so that that arrangement continues, where Tripoli or the GNA, which is a conflict party, does not have sole and full control over the management of the oil and gas sector, and also the import of the fuel into Libya. So it's very important to keep that, as I said, in which context we are talking about the reorganization of the oil and gas sector or financial institution at large, whether we are at a conflict state or transition from conflict to peace or at peace, and that's very important. On the question of US leverage on Cairo, I think we can all agree that because it is an elections year and because of all the internal turmoil that we are witnessing in the United States, it's very difficult to see, it's difficult to predict exactly where things would head with the United States and whether Trump will win an election or not, and what November 3rd will bring for the United States and for the region and the world as a whole. But what we are witnessing recently is a more active role for the conventional, for the traditional foreign policy establishment of the United States taking lead on the Libya file, be it through the ambassador, the veteran of the Foreign Service, Norland Richard, or be it the fact that we are seeing AFRICOM and we are seeing the Pentagon and the State Department taking over. And in that regard, I think the United States might have, through these tools, some leverage on Cairo. But let's also remember that it is not in Cairo's interest that Russia becomes the dominant actor in Eastern Libya. Because for the Egyptians, this is an area of influence and national security interest for the Egyptians. Why should the Emiratis or should the Russians or the Turks or anyone else should have presence there? And I think this dominates the thinking within the, if you like, the Egyptian decision-making circle, in my view. So I think if there is a sustained effort by the United States and guarantees to the Egyptians about the role of Turkey and the future of governance in Libya, the issue of wealth distribution, the issue of the Muslim Brotherhood and political Islam, and so on. If there are some form of acceptable guarantees, then I think there will be enough leverage that that the United States can exercise on Cairo to play the role that the United States wants Cairo to play in Libya.
Thank you, Muhammad. We have several questions.
Sorry, can I add very last point? Very last point. Just on the issue of the NOC. So I think now for Khalifa Haftar and his allies, they have now come to a realization that it has become impossible to capture Tripoli. I think what we will start to witness going forward is that France, Egypt, and even the UAE will be pushing a lot more for a more of a decentralized form of governance, especially when it comes to the management of the oil revenues and the economic institutions. There will definitely be a push to try and, if you cannot take Tripoli, try and take as many spoils out of Tripoli as possible. I think that mindset, which I think what Vladimir was pointing to, actually exists, and we are seeing it at play, and it is partly why Cairo is emphasizing this issue in the declaration that it made. But we will also witness the French pushing for similar arrangements to take place, with the aim of not giving Turkey and the GNA exclusive authority over Libya's oil revenues and the management of Libya's oil revenues.
Thank you, Muhammad. I have a list of participants who want to intervene. And the first is Claudia Gazzini. Claudia, I will ask.
Yes, hi, thank you.
Hi, Claudia from International Crisis Group.
Yes, I'm Claudia from the International Crisis Group. Thank you for the conversation. Hello, Mohammed. Thank you for your remarks. A brief question on the financial sustainability of Russia's military support to Khalifa Haftar. Because if we link your remarks about what attempts have been made by the LNA to sell oil, get a financial reset of the arrangements of oil revenues, and Russia's military involvement, the conclusion that I make is that on the first point, they haven't been able to sell oil independently and are unlikely to be able to sell oil independently in the near future. Two, they have not been able to have a financial reset of how oil revenues are managed in the past few years. And the US Treasury position was very key in this. And even while we were in the midst of war in Tripoli, there was absolutely no move in favor of a financial reset, meaning central bank in Tripoli remained in control of the assets. And now with Turkish military power, there's, I think, going to be even less of an opportunity to have a financial reset. So if Russia is thinking about long-term investment in Libya and possible continued military support to Haftar and the LNA, how is it going to be financially sustainable, given that even the other Arab backers of the LNA are, and this is the third variable, under increasing financial distress because of the global reduction in oil prices? Do you have thoughts of how Russia can square its interest, military involvement, with the financial sort of closing of the financial window for getting paybacks?
Yeah.
Muhammad, please, your answer. Maybe then some of our Russian participants want to comment it. Okay. First, sure.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much. Good to have you with us, Claudia, and a very pertinent question. Just to point out, firstly, that the financial situation in the East is extremely difficult. And speaking last week to government officials, they said that they have 1 billion Libyan dinars at the moment that they can spend. They are trying to secure 2 more billions in the process. Also, we have the Minister of Finance in Eastern Libya being held captive by the LNA in the East, and it is related to issues with regards to funding and to money. So the financial situation for the Eastern authorities overall is extremely dire in that regard. With regards to your question about Russia, I think there are only 2 options possibly to go for here. Number one is for Russia to decide or to succeed, let's say, in finding a political partner in the East in the body of Aguila Saleh and what he represents in terms of local and international legitimacy, and sign some deals with him. In that regard, as the head of the House of Representatives. Again, there will be lots of questions whether it is legitimate or not, just like whether the Turkish agreement with the GNA was legitimate or not, or whether all of these questions, but at least it will give a veneer of legitimacy and political cover for that move. And I think we have seen Russia playing up the role of Aguila Saleh and advising him and so on. And if they manage to get that, then they can start to deal with the Eastern camp and the Eastern authorities with a little bit of ease, just like Turkey is dealing with the GNA internationally recognized with ease. And there have been attempts in this direction, but it is not easy, as I said, because Aguila Saleh is not his own man, and he still is under the influence of other regional actors that might not be happy or would not want to see Russia becoming the dominant actor in the East, be it Egypt or be it the UAE in this regard. But the recent standoff that we also witnessed with regards to the shipment of notes that was captured in Malta, we have seen the Russians doubling down on the fact that they printed this money and they continue to print this money legally. They see this as a legal enterprise and as a business enterprise for them. And again, it gives you a little bit of an indication that the Russians are able to stick to their guns in this regard. The best case scenario for Russia to reap or to sow some of the benefits, the economic benefits in particular, in Libya, would be the following: that the push that would happen towards the east by Turkey and the GNA, and Russia is able to be the equalizer, not Egypt, not the UAE, but Russia really shows that they are the equalizer, and they do put an end to that ambition of moving eastwards, and they create that equilibrium. I think it is only then that Russia can then start to dictate terms along with its Eastern partners with regards to economic benefits, with regards to the distribution of wealth, with regards to all of these issues. But in answer to your question, for the time being, it's very difficult to see how Russia can sustain its military operations in Libya unless either it is paid for by Russia itself, and people will say Russia might not have the means, or it is paid by a third partner, be it the Emirates or others. But as you rightly pointed out, that these countries currently have their, they are recalibrating their positions, or they are reconsidering their positions. So I think the best case scenario for Russia to reap any benefits is to act as the equalizer. The use of violence and the use of force against Turkey and the GNA, or stopping them from actually moving towards the East. And by then they become the true partner for the East, and then they can dictate terms and they can become part of the table. The question is, will Russia be able to do that or not? I think Turkey and the United States are going to put them to test in the coming period.
Thank you, Muhammad. Anybody else wants to comment it? If Konstantin and Alexander Shumilin. Konstantin first, and then Alexander Shumilin. Konstantin, please.
If the question was about the possibility of further Russian military involvement in Libya, I will say no. That doesn't mean that my own opinion would be shared by decision makers in Russia, but that's my own point of view. Why? Russia, of course, is interested in the point that Haftar would not be completely defeated. But at the same time, I think that Russia is not interested in a full victory of Haftar. It is more interested in a sort of balance between Haftar and GNA. That corresponds to Russian interests in Libya more. That's my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. And please, Alexander Shumilin.
Okay. You hear me? Okay. Thank you for the invitation, madam. First of all, I would like to greet once again and to thank Mohammed. I just want to remember him, to remind him we met last time if he remembers in Seoul, it was some years ago. Yes,
correct. I remember, 2015.
Yeah, okay. Okay, you were the main speaker in the Libyan panel. Yeah. So it was great, like this time also. I would like to talk about many aspects, but we don't have enough time. So first of all, yes, the main topic of our seminar is the oil, and you are the best, in my eyes, specialist among the Libyans, Libyan experts, or Libyan origins expert, because you was in London somewhere else. Anyway, I think we don't have to exaggerate the oil aspect and the oil, despite the fact that the oil is the main wealth of Libya, of course, no doubt. If it is benediction, as the King Idris said once, or a curse, we shall see. But it is not the only wealth of Libya. There are some other dimensions, very variable in the eyes of many regional and even global powers. I mean, the strategic importance, the strategic value of Libya, of nation. And there is another aspect which I would like to focus on, religious aspect. We have not to underestimate all these issues. For example, hearing you talking about Turkey, saying that the oil is the main point in Turkish strategy towards GNA. Yes, because everything in Libya is related to oil. Yes, but I would be doubtful about the matter and about the point that it is the only value, the only goal of Turkey. Turkey is a deeply rooted regional power, so its interest is very much multiple in the region, and we cannot negate the fact that everyone, every power, every foreign actor prevailing in Libya will control its main wealth, or yes, or will impact, will influence the situation over it. Yes, but to which extent is Turkey, for example, interested in oil? To a large extent, but not definitely, because Turkey is interested in controlling the Eastern Mediterranean with some oil drilling over, for example, some pipelines, and to some extent, Turkey is viewing Libya under foreign control, not under Turkish control, under rival control, as a rival to the Turkish pipelines conducting oil and providing oil to Europe, for example. Yes, my main point is that the real interests of the regional powers, I just enumerate them: Saudi Arabia, Emirates, Egypt, Turkey. The main interests of those powers go beyond oil, and one of important aspect is religion factor. We have not mentioned religion at all these days. Yes, for Saudis or Emiratis, oil is important. I remember 4,000 times. But is it the main driver behind their behavior there, maybe behind their backing Haftar? Not at all, I think. It is something secondary. The main factor and driver is for Emirates and Saudis to prevent prevailing GNA forever with their Muslim Brothers component, to prevent the case or the situation where Libya might become a very important place, home if you want, for the Muslim Brotherhood in the future. It's something destructive for the Saudis and Emirates strategies and their views. This is the same question why Russia cannot be reconciled with Turkey. Because Russia is playing double role, ambivalent role. On one part, it is involved on the side of the regional players, with Emirates, Saudis in one camp against Turkey and Qatar. But on the other side, Russia is playing a global game. It's playing out global game, and it's trying to defend its interest going much beyond Libya, starting from Libya, because of Libya, but going much beyond Libya. Global interest, suggesting its relationship with Europe, with United States, and suggesting a kind of normalization of its situation in the Middle East. So, if we come to the issue of religion's role in this matter, so it is the same case what we can witness, observe in Syria now, when Emirates and Saudis are moving more and more to back Assad in view to withstand Turkey, to confront Turkey. This is the same reflection, if you want, in Libya. So it is a religion factor. We have nothing to do with oil. More of that. The value of oil is decreasing now, as it has been mentioned now by Claudia and some other speakers. So it is my brief intervention and comment, but to conclude, how to summarize it and shape it in a form of a question to you, how do you classify those issues, those aspects, strategic aspects, dimension, religion dimension, and oil dimension? Do you really believe that oil dimension is overwhelmingly prevailing there, or not? In my eyes, not at all. I'm sorry for you as a prominent oil expert.
Yeah,
it is a very important issue and aspect because of.
Thank you very much. No, I think we agree to an extent. I pointed during my first intervention that we should be looking at Libya, or the importance of Libya, in a much wider way, be it in the sense of the energy factor, which is the title of the session today, but also in terms of the geostrategy or geopolitical dimension of this. Like how Turkey or Russia or any other regional players tries to use Libya as piece of the puzzle, if you like, for the projection of its power and of its influence. I think we always must keep that wider view. There is not a single specific issue that will drive any country or the other. There are multifaceted issues in the process. I think the difference between Turkey and Russia at the moment, or any other actor, I think Turkey came in with very clear goals as to what it wanted to achieve and with what means it wanted to achieve them. On the issue of oil, why is oil important in Libya at the end of the day? That is the only way that Libya can pay its dues. That is the only way that Libya can pay for the contracts. That is the only way that these countries can get the economic benefits that they were looking for, or the military investment, the return for whatever military investment they have put into Libya. And that is why the control of wealth and the question of wealth and so on is a very important one. But it is not, let's say, it is not the only issue that is driving what some countries doing. I think an important point was mentioned with regards to ideology, and it is a very pertinent point to mention. I think it is always worth going back and exploring the changes that have occurred in the foreign policy mindset within Turkey, be it on the ideological level within the political circle after the Akbay came to power in the early 2000s, or be it from within the military establishment itself, the doctrine of the blue homeland and so on, and how is that military plus ideology mindset is driving this Turkish ambition and this Turkish projection of power. And Libya is only one piece of the puzzle. Tunisia is part of that. Algeria is part of that. And other countries are also part of that aspect. And since we are talking about Russia, it's very important that we don't forget to mention who the natural allies for Russia are really in the Libyan political spectrum. And usually the pointer would point to former regime figures, be it Saif al-Islam or be it the former regime figures that Moscow has interaction with at the moment. What Moscow tried to do over the years since it increased its contact with Libya in 2015 in particular, is that they pushed Khalifa Haftar to accept the return of former regime officers. They have facilitated some meetings, and they insisted that the former regime be part of that project that Haftar was leading. However, the Russians and Haftar did not agree on the role of Saif al-Islam. And what role should Saif al-Islam? Because eventually Khalifa Haftar has an ego problem and he does not share power. Now we are witnessing some interesting reports. They're not even rumors somehow, that the GNA and Turkey are now reaching out to former regime figures. They are even reaching out to Saif al-Islam's people. The Islamists in particular have an experience working with Saif al-Islam before the 2011 revolution. So that is also an interesting dynamic that one can keep an eye on. And if somehow Russia can actually see its natural allies in the Libya scene, which is not necessarily Haftar, but Haftar was at some point, it could be the former regime or the role that Saif al-Islam could be playing in the process. And I think that's an interesting dynamic to keep as far as Russia's involvement in Libya is concerned.
Thank you, Muhammad. I have two more questions in my list. The first is Michel Cousin. Please, Michel. Yes.
You can hear me. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mohammed, you've mentioned, you used the word partition at the very beginning. You talk about the possibility of GNA taking Jufra and Sirte and forces moving to the east. And in this case, you mentioned Russia and others not wanting the GNA forces to move towards the east. In effect, the possibility therefore becomes that we have a partition of Libya. We have a partition at the moment, but it's not geographically consistent. So, but it seems to be becoming that. And I take the view, and maybe you disagree, that if Jufra falls, the south will fall back in line with the GNA. But if you get that happening, are we going to see an actual de facto partition of Libya, where still everybody says there's one Libya, but we end up with two Libyas, an east and a west, and in fact, the rest of the world living with it? Because at the moment, international dialogue, attempts at dialogue are not working. The Cairo initiative was born dead. And is never going to work any more than a Turkish initiative would work at the moment. And so are we moving towards inevitably some sort of partition, and can it be stopped, whereby the rest of the world accepts there are two Libyas, just as we have two Koreas, we've got two Cypruses, we have mainland China and Taiwan, both claiming to be the real government of China, so that you accept the idea there's still one Libya, but in reality, you've got two, which the rest of the world then works with, which can then get on with living their own lives. And even the two Libyas reach a modus vivendi, and both are exporting oil because both have got gas and oil reserves.
I think it's always important these days to ask this question. I think it was important to ask this question even back in 2012, the issue of partition in Libya, and it's a very important question to put at the table. Here is what I think. I see three different scenarios in Libya that could play out. The first one is a military victory for one side, to take over, like to completely take over the country and establish some form of control over the entire territory of Libya, be it the GNA or the other side. Haftar might have been able to do it at some point last year in September or October, but this is now impossible. Some in the GNA, with the help of Turkey, think they can do it, especially the Islamists in particular. Khalid al-Mishri, who jumped to Erdogan after the visit of Sarraj, and he is pushing a certain narrative, if you like, or selling a certain idea. I am still of the view that a complete military victory for one side or the other is extremely difficult, if not impossible. The second option is a political solution with the help of the United Nations, and then somehow we managed to revive the international efforts in Libya, and we see a political settlement of some sort, and we progress in the direction of, establishing a consensus government, constitution, election, and then Libya starts to become a functional or with a minimum functional state. Again, that is also extremely difficult to envision at the moment, given the internal, regional, but also international dynamics. What's the third scenario? The third scenario is that there is no political solution and there is no military solution. And it is the scenario that you talked about, where we start as Libyans and regional and international actors to accept this reality for now. And what we end up with is the formalization of whatever de facto partition exists now. But that also will have to have some sort of a political settlement on what the terms of such partition would look like. How do you deal with the issue of the oil installations and the vital, and the fact that these are very connected with each other throughout Libya? The form of governance, what shape does it take? Is it strong federalism, confederalism, or actual partition where you have completely two different states? But my view is the following. Even then, you will not have functional Libyan parts. You will have protectorates, i.e., what we end up with is a political and geographic space that is under the control of foreign actors. And in my view, it is the foreign actors who are willing to use violence and the tools of force to conduct their foreign policy who will be able to determine that level of influence within these emerging parts of Libya, if you like. To avoid that, what we need is a concerted effort from key powers like the United States. I do not see that commitment. I do not see that genuine commitment from the United States, even with the current push, because It is mainly a knee-jerk reaction, in my view, to the fact that the Russians are increasing their influence. The United States is not in the Libya scene now to actually resolve it. They could have done this in 2012. They are in it to just stop the Russians from actually gaining a foothold. And that is not a policy or a strategy to resolve a conflict or to have peace. Europe continues to be divided and frozen from within. So the way I see this is definitely we are heading towards a scenario where Libya becomes a political and a geographic space that is under the influence and the control of foreign actors who are willing to use military force to have influence on the ground.
Thank you, Muhammad. As I know, Vladimir Bertenev, who I have to say specialize on United States-Libyan relations, who has written a brilliant monography on this topic, he wants to comment this issue too. Please,
yeah, I just wanted to maybe continue with your deliberations on the U.S. role, because I think that we have to keep in mind many other factors when we think about what the U.S. can and cannot do in Libya. As far as history of Libya is concerned and the history of the U.S. involvement in Libya is concerned, they were eager to involve really deeply into the country only where they see really huge geopolitical threat. Either it was the Stalin's plans to establish the bases in the southern Mediterranean. That was something that provoked the Vilas base that the US had in Libya, as you remember, or in the Reagan era when they saw everything through the lens of the conflict with the evil empire, and they wanted to promote this agenda, right? But in other periods, the oil was something that, especially in the Nixon era, in Carter era, in Ford era, it was something that basically prevented, even in the Gaddafi era, the US from doing something really important and serious in Libya, because they were interested in Libyan oil. Now, the situation is completely different in these regards. In terms of dependence on oil, there is none, because the United States has become #1 of oil producing country, and there is no need to do anything on that front. And in terms of ideological confrontation, I do not think that the Trump administration, that it's actually anti-ideological in a way, that does not want great games in terms of ideology. The ideological factor is not there right now. The Chinese, as far as I know, do not have that influence in the country right now because of the security risk, etc., to push the United States into Libya. And again, so in terms of geostrategic competition, maybe it's a Russian factor that can drive the United States in. But I think it's not enough in the current situation, definitely. The United States probably would be willing to actually, to give the Libyan dossier to someone else. But they are not happy with anyone in the region right now. Not with Saudi Arabia, not with Egypt, not with Europeans, because and the Europeans are not capable of really changing the situation on the ground. So not with Turkey. And this makes me come to the point where actually the most important thing that can change the calculus of all the actors is how the United States would react towards any possible deals, open or hidden, between Turkey and Russia. This is the most important thing. And the last, I think last week, there was a call between Erdogan and Trump, where there was some signs of, you know, re-establishing some kind of relations. Probably this is the hint of what is actually can be the US role right now. If they want the Russians out, they would push through Turks. But if they really interested in having the same kind of quagmire that actually they do not have anything to lose from, big, large things, they're not losing from the Libyan quagmire, to my mind, not in terms of you know, investments, not in terms of money and effort. Libya is very far from the sphere of the direct influence. So I think we have to keep in mind the huge change in terms of what Libya is on the US mindset in general, comparing to our historical periods.
Muhammad, please.
Yeah, very quickly, and I agree with a lot of what you said, Vladimir. Last year, I had an exercise of going through all the United States, or as many of the United States statements on Libya as possible. And guess what? Most of their statements you will find focused on, especially after 2014, let's say, are focused on terrorism, oil and gas. Usually, that is the themes. And even democracy doesn't feature, even human rights in many statements doesn't feature. So it has been from, you could say, from 2014 to 2019, it has been these two issues, oil and gas and terrorism. And you can go back to these statements, most of them talking about these two key issues. Now it has become Russia. Every day they are now sending out a statement of some sort. So it is these three keys that seem to be moving the United States to say something or to act when it comes to Libya. I also agree with you that the United States until now is not interested or has not been interested in playing a direct role. Even in 2011, they invented the leading from behind concept, where the Europeans were supposed to be the leaders and the United States was just there to enable. I don't think that has changed. And I agree with you that although you say that they might not be happy with any of the actors, be it the Europeans or the Arabs, I think the Turks, for now, especially if the Turks and the GNA manage to prove that they can be effective in the areas that are under their control in terms of establishing security and governance structures that are able to respond to services, able to respond to economic revival, able to respond to the key services to the population and so on. And if they prove to be a more effective partner there, I don't see why the United States would not give their blessing to that Turkish role. And why I think that the Turks and the United States are more on the same page now than ever before in Libya is the fact that now there is talk about them setting up a joint working group on Libya at the highest levels when it comes to coordination on security, military, but other issues on Libya. So the call could be significant in that regard between Erdogan and Trump. And if it does translate in this high level coordination, then I think Turkey will become the capable hands of the United States in Libya against, as I said, again, against the Russians. And I think the coming period, we will witness Turkey and the United States putting Russia's resolve to test in Sirte, in Jufra, and elsewhere. Again, you will notice that the Americans are working hard to bring the Turks and the GNA and the Egyptians closer together and agree to work together despite their disagreements on any other issues, but to work together in order to find some sort of an acceptable arrangement in Libya there. So that's what I wanted to say on that, Vladimir.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Muhammad. Thank you, dear participants. If we don't have other interveners, we're of time. We work more than 1 hour and a half. I think it was a very interesting and very fruitful discussion. One of the most interesting I have handled last time. But I expected it from Mohammed, from you, always.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, and it's good to be with all of you.
Thank you. And guys, I have sent to the chat information about 2 other events we'll have next week. Welcome everybody. We'll send to our partners and to our colleagues, we'll send information to email if we have your emails, sure. And have a good weekend, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.